Welcome everybody to the podcast Beyond Perception. Today I'm here with Nick from the podcast From Ideology to Unity, and we will talk a little bit about ideology, why it matters, political systems, and it is a true pleasure, because that's your background, it's a true pleasure to welcome you here, and awesome to have this conversation.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for interviewing me.
Yeah, first of all, it would be really interesting to hear a bit about your personal background. You studied politics, and now you are launching this podcast. So, really curious to hear a bit about your journey and why you do what you do. And
yeah, okay. So, I am. When I was young, I grew up with a muscle condition that's Becker's muscular dystrophy. So, it's a milder form of muscular dystrophy compared to the more common form. But it meant that at school I wasn't performing well at sports, and so physically, right? And so beliefs are really important about how you interact with the world, right? And if this is partly me looking at hindsight, but I feel like because I felt that I was weaker than other children, that I was weak, that general belief in weakness may have developed this idea that I couldn't, that I started having thoughts and feelings associated with the idea of being weak, and I couldn't do it. And it led to a habit of giving up, I suppose. Right? Now, I'm probably not the only one who's had experiences like that. We've all got our experiences when we're young that affect our beliefs and our thoughts and our feelings in ways that aren't necessarily healthy for us or beneficial for us. So I also later developed epilepsy, which wasn't ideal, but I got medication for it, so I was all right. And also I ended up, turns out I've been diagnosed with ADHD and Asperger's. I didn't know this for years, but I always had the sense that I was different. And when you grow up and you don't feel like you fit in, it can be challenging, definitely. Especially if you have trouble applying yourself. Definitely, it can affect self-esteem and being quite challenging. But I feel like perhaps I represent a lot of the issues that young men that Jordan Peterson is trying to help. So, yeah, my road to self-improvement and recovery from essentially being lost without any purpose in life was actually through Jordan Peterson. Actually, let me backtrack a little bit. Actually, you haven't asked me any questions yet, but
I'm listening. I will have
so
some. Yeah.
when I studied politics as a bachelor's and international political economy as a master's, but I struggled to apply myself, so I didn't do at all as well as I could have done. And at several points, I almost failed my master's just because of the workload. I wasn't really managing it in an effective way. I was procrastinating severely, right? With the internet and everything, and we've got a short attention spans in our generation, but I suppose I had it quite badly in my own way. But fundamentally, I was responsible for my life. And the buck stops at you, right? And I realized reading Jordan Peterson that you can't just point the blame at society or other people. Or your parenting, you've got to take responsibility for turning your life around. Now, that's not easy, especially if you've got bad habits, but you can do it. Because even someone who had really bad body clock and really severe procrastination and various other issues, including behavioral issues and so forth, like I managed to turn it around. So I feel like it's definitely, even if you're losing hope, it's definitely possible. You just got to rewire your beliefs eternally and how you relate to the world. Okay, so I'll let you ask another question.
You mentioned quite a few things, which
Yeah.
which I would be really curious to hear more about. So, um, first of all, you mentioned that you experience your life as different to others, or
Yes.
you or your life experience different than others. And you mentioned also that you were diagnosed with, I think you said Asperger's
And ADHD.
and
That was only a few
ADHD.
years
And
ago.
yes, so what I mean, from personally over this year, maybe like I'm I'm really more aware that each one of our experiences of life is very subjective, and
Yeah, yeah.
I imagine it. Yeah, like, and I'm curious to hear from you if that makes sense or not at all. That reality is it's information, and we see or experience this reality through a filter, which you could say it's our personality, it's our vehicle, body, mind, and it's
Yeah.
different, like from person to person. So I imagine that, and then also with our five senses, we have access to really a certain amount of information out there, which is not all there is. And so, like, I imagine, for example, Asperger's, or like as a maybe a different filter than most of other people have. And so
Yeah, that's a very
maybe
good way of putting it.
that maybe with Asperger's you have access to maybe more information or different information
Probably different.
than someone with like perceived normal filter. But like normal is then another question again. So like how does that relate to you? Does that make sense at all? Or
Well, yeah. So I see it like a trade-off. You know, like in role-play games where you choose your character, you choose your setup,
Mhm.
and your base stats, like D&D or something, right?
Mhm.
I mean, having Asperger's and, well, if you have Asperger's and ADHD, all that really is like a different class or like a different set of base stats from what's normal.
Mhm.
And that's going to have certain advantages in terms of what information you get through the filter.
Well, like if you say advantages, what would be an advantage, or what do you see is easier for you, for example, than like others or like normal people?
Perhaps certain cognitive benefits in terms of understanding how things fit together as systems and being able to take a step back and not, well, be able to understand detail, I suppose, in a detached way. Does that too. So understanding things, because there has been some research by, I can't remember the guy's name, but he was Simon Baron Cohen, about the idea that people who are autistic or Asperger's have a very, what he called, a masculine personality,
Mhm.
which is, the way he put it is that, the way he analyzed it was the idea that men orientate relatively more towards things, and women are more likely to orientate more towards people. But this is just a relative thing. But that anyone, that's just only the general tendency. That anyone is somewhere on that spectrum, and that, yeah, people who are autistic or Asperger's, they tend to be more systemizing as opposed to empathizing. But that doesn't mean you can't systemize if you're in the empathizing direction or vice versa. You can. It's just a matter of inclination. I suppose maybe that's the nature of the ego we start with, but that can be shaped as well through experiences. Because experiences make a huge difference to our lives as well, right? In any case, so we start with a filter. Perhaps my filter gives me certain advantages in certain areas to understanding how things work. But at the same time, it might give you certain disadvantages. Certainly, socially speaking, I was behind in learning to talk at a later age, slightly. Uh, I I learned how to ride a bike later than normal, and I am and developing social skills. It took longer and more effort over sustained through the years to actually get to a relatively standard or acceptable level of social skills. And even then, how social I am will depend on whether or not it's one of my special interests or just generally. Like, yeah, so it definitely took time to develop social skills to a normal level, or even a sub-normal level. But yeah, as you put it, we've all got a filter, and the filters are different, and that's just simply a trade-off. There's nothing good or bad about the nature of the filter. It's like a class in D&D, right?
It's super interesting. And would you say that this filter defines you, or that maybe now that you said that a couple of years you had the diagnosis, yeah, kind of,
Yeah.
like, did this enable more understanding? And then, like, and also, do you see that you're kind of like removing this filter in a sense more and more? That's like for
Yeah.
my personal uh, description of how I would say, like, define awakening as a big label. And
Yeah.
what makes sense for me is to waking up from our subjective perspective to become more and more objective. See more and more of what there is, and also understand that, like, our personality, yeah, it's kind of this initial filter, but it's also not what defines us. It's kind of a starting vehicle.
Yeah.
So
we start off perhaps with certain predispositions. Maybe if you're going to be real mystical about it, maybe we chose before this lifetime what those predispositions were, because maybe we had certain goals in our life that we wanted to achieve, or certain sort of just a way we wanted to do things, right? But then also from a young age, we're conditioned by society and by our parents in particular ways, and each experience there is unique, but also fits into the patterns of our society as a whole, right? Or even the patterns of in our family that might be passed down ways of doing things. That, I mean, for example, you get, if you with abusive parenting, you get like that goes down generations because people learn it from their parents, right? That's one example. It's a negative example, but yes. So we learn. So from a very young age, we start with nature and nurture having a very big impact. So it's kind of unique every time how we turn out, but we're not really conscious of it for a long time, right? So we just feel like it's happening to us, and we don't have a role in it. We feel like it's all just happening to us. We're certainly not aware of the law of attraction. Most people aren't yet, but.
And you mentioned Jordan Peterson before. He was like a part in this waking up, and you mentioned also that he kind of reminded you or put your attention to that, like, each one of us is ultimately responsible for our life, and that no matter where we are, like how tough it is,
so
we
around
have
the time
responsibility for it.
Around the time I encountered Jordan Peterson, I was having issues with other people because it might be related to my condition of Asperger's, or maybe not. But in any case, I had developed a tendency to be quite hypersensitive to criticism. Sometimes there were jokes that I got offended at, and not realizing they were jokes. And sometimes I just was too afraid for an argument to let go of it, because I felt like, I was afraid of how it would turn out if it didn't go a certain way. So there, I had all sorts of issues, and Jordan Peterson's ideas were part of what helped me realize, wait a minute, I can choose how I respond. And it's me that's partly choosing this, right? So his insight really did help. I don't know, it might have been partly subconscious, because I don't think I entirely made the connection between it being Jordan Peterson stuff and me realizing that about how to deal with these issues. But in any case,
if if it were a concrete example, you said that discussions you had the sense of, or like not getting the joke, or like, or discussions you felt the urge to keep right, like, and how did this insights from Jordan Peterson change this, or like how then, like what was the new or different reaction you learned from it, or like,
Well,
or,
partly it was Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life and watching his content, and partly it was a situation where I was quite lonely because I didn't really, for years after graduating, I hadn't really done much. I'd been kind of lost and without a purpose. I hadn't been socializing that much. And so I kind of was lonely, didn't have a social network. So I started socializing online. And what happened is I kind of was rejected by one of the only groups I had, socially speaking, because of my actions. And I wasn't conscious of how I'd been behaving. I saw it as everyone else had done things, right?
Mhm.
And so Jordan Peterson's, when I was socially rejected because of what I'd read from Jordan Peterson and what I watched, it allowed me to be a little bit more mindful and aware of how it had happened. Not at first, it was a gradual process of realization, right? And because I was quite stubborn about accepting certain things, especially when it's emotionally difficult, but I had to, and I got up and I made the changes necessary. And I feel like we all can do this. When things go wrong, we actually have a catalyst, an opportunity to change. When things are going, when we're comfortable, it's harder to change. It's time to change is when suddenly we're thrown into chaos. That's the opportunity. And a lot of people are in chaos now. So now is actually an excellent opportunity to make changes internally and externally to transform your life. So yeah. Yeah.
Wow, that's yeah, those are really, really good insights, and yeah, worth to reflecting upon again. Yeah, it's really when, also from personal experience, struggle, challenges, like even doubts, yeah, like limiting thoughts, yeah, they kind of, it's when you're at the threshold, and then there's this decision, like you're exposed to your limitations, like, am I accepting them or not? And like you mentioned before that you studied politics, so like,
Yeah.
and also now with your podcast, it's really about diving, from what I understand, and diving into politics, spirituality, psychology, philosophy, and also about discovering truth. And like, and its name is from ideology to unity. So could you tell a bit about what's ideology, what it is, like because some of the listeners might not really have a context, or why
Right.
why is it potentially limiting?
So I could start from my experience and then we could expand into
Mm-hmm.
a more general idea of the concepts. So I could have chosen from dogma to ideology, but personally, I didn't find it had the same ring to it, even though that might be more accurate to what I'm talking about.
Is there a
But
difference between dogma and
I
ideology? I
suppose
mean,
there probably is, but they've got a similar meaning. In any case,
okay.
so my experience was that, so I studied politics because I was interested in it and I didn't know what else to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I I did learn a lot of interesting things, but the thing is I ended up becoming quite ideological. Personally, I ended up becoming, well, first I became a libertarian, anarcho-capitalist, and then a libertarian. So I ended up moderating it a bit, but I was becoming quite radical in my own way. But when things didn't fit in to the worldview that I'd adopted, I just kind of ignored them because I wanted it was comforting to have this neat, tidy, convenient set of beliefs. And we can make the world better if we just, well, this is the formula, right? And it just, when you're idealist and you see problems in the world, but simple solutions can feel like, well, we could just transform it in these really big ways, and yeah, that will work. And what if you see things that don't fit into it? Like, for example, with me, at first, I didn't accept, libertarianism, especially anarcho-capitalism, talks about open borders, right?
Mhm.
Because to have a state with borders controls the freedom of the people who potentially come in. So I ended up adopting the open idea of open borders. But then I started to become aware of problems with that. At first I ignored it, right? But eventually I couldn't. So when I was being more honest with myself, I had to moderate my position a bit to libertarianism. And even then I had to moderate it then a little bit more as I learned more to something more like classical liberalism. And every time I moderated or adjusted my position to account for new things, that was me being more honest with myself and learning new things and adjusting to it as I matured, I guess. And so my journey is, I ended up getting very much into ideology and dogma, a strict, I suppose you could say, a doctrine of ideas that you believe in, almost like a priori, and that's very much a filter. It's even more of a filter than I had before I got into politics, which wasn't really the right direction to go into. But partly it was my attempt to understand the world, I suppose, in an egoic way. Like, in any case, so the problem that I have experience with is that I know what it's like to be stuck in an ideological mindset. And I know what it's like when you're interacting with other people, because other people might have different ideologies or dogmas or what have you, and you might feel that they're the enemy and that they're a threat, and you're afraid of them, or you're angry at what they've done, and you identify with your group and you identify them as a group, and you identify your group as having been hurt by their group, right? So when I got into the culture war, which my side that I was on, I suppose I chose a side, was the opposing quote SJW side, right? I got very much into that, probably more than I even got into libertarianism in a way. That was, I didn't even realize, because it was opposition to something, that it was very much an ideology, that I was stuck in a fight or flight mentality about them, that I was afraid that what they do to society or how my life would be impacted. And when I got into arguments with them, I identified that as them causing the problems. And I didn't really see my role in things. And my understanding is that whenever you're in an ideology, no matter what that ideology is, it's that same sort of story as for everyone, really, in that there's a lack of empathy for the other side, because you're only focusing on the fear and the anger associated between the interaction between the two tribes, or maybe more than two tribes. Like, I understand that for, let's say, radical feminists, their experience was probably similar to mine. They just had a different narrative and a different set of ideas. Now, we could disagree about which ideas have more correspondence to reality than others, but that's almost part of the trap, where you're arguing over, I'm right and you're wrong. You put a flag in it and you're just ring fencing it. And I've been there, right? So I understand that for people of ideologies that I opposed previously, like, it was me and them, we were more similar than we realized. And when I realized that, right, it changed everything, because I was like, okay, I started seeing more, I started seeing actual insight in ideas that I thought were just completely wrong. That doesn't mean I agreed with them as a whole, but certainly I could find insight from opposing ideas, or different variety of ideas, ranging from communism, even all sorts of ideas, anarchism, left, right, authoritarian, liberal, and everything in between. Like, I started I mean, even when I was arguing with people, I started learning about where they're coming from simply by trying to argue against them. But eventually, especially when I stopped arguing with them so much, when I decided to abandon arguing with them altogether, then it's when I really started seeing that there's there's things that they all notice about the world, but there's other things that are blind spots because of their ideology. Because each filter is a trade-off, and it gives you more insight and less insight in different areas, right? And the filter you choose does that just as much as the filter you chose before your life, right? So
That's say again.
yeah, so the reason when I discovered spirituality, I suppose you could say it's a new age sort of ideas, or it's called the law of one in my case, but there's similarities to, I suppose, maybe the Hare Krishna ideas or the Buddhism, Taoism. East Asian ideas have a lot in common with it, I suppose. And it's this idea that there's this sense of oneness and everything's connected. We can go in more into that later, but when I got to that sort of perspective, I was especially drawn to a more holistic way of looking at things that draws upon, in a syncretic way, the advantages or aspects of different sets of ideas. Now, if you don't know what syncretism is, syncretism was originally an idea about religion that draws upon other religions. But the way I see it is we can do that with ideology and dogma and political philosophies. We can do that, and we can develop a less filtered understanding of reality that's more objective. So yeah, I talked quite a while. So
No, it's
do you have any more questions?
super interesting. There are, again, a couple of interesting things. So, from what I understood, ideology is kind of really a construct which provides, in a sense, safety or security because it's a worldview I believe, and then I kind of filter out everything which doesn't fit into this like perspective or filter, as you said, and like if someone threatens your belief system, it's kind of like your survival instincts are activated, and it's kind of, and you feel threatened by the other group, so you're really, instead of listening to each other or like discovering maybe truth together, or like what's the best outcome, it's more about defending your position. Is there a good ideology, or is like and also like maybe you can give a few more examples of the ideologies we buy into, or maybe even like are not aware of that those are ideologies, because you could also say that like just being born into this world, we adopt so many ideologies unconsciously without really being aware of it. You mentioned communism you mentioned before, and that's kind of like, that's something I would consciously say this is a certain way of thinking.
Yeah, but if you grow up in communism, you might not even realize you're in communism, or at least it would be different, right? A different way of. So you're right that we have to ask questions, because I might not even know, or I might still have ideologies that I'm not aware of. We all might do that, and what it comes down to is questioning what you believe. Well, one clue is things that you ignore, beliefs that you have that close you off from other beliefs, right? So
how do you get aware of them?
Except that when you come across them. Oh, because some people might not even be aware that they're not letting it in, right? Because like you might feel like someone's just saying stupid things, or someone's being horrible, when it actually might be something outside of your perception that you're misunderstanding. In fact, if we go on a personal level, when people were criticizing me, sometimes they were actually trying to help me. And I didn't realize, I just felt, because I reacted hurt in a fight or flight way, I was stuck in this, I ended up in this perspective where it's almost like a persecuted mindset. And if you're in an ideology, is there anything, that's it. When you have an emotional reaction, there's two things actually, an emotional reaction and judgment. When you feel threatened, when you feel attacked, that's a signpost to some sort of belief that you hold. Not always, but it may well be a signpost of belief that you hold that is being questioned or called into question. An identity that you have, perhaps, that is being threatened. Now, that's the thing with identity, is that the more you identify and attach to things, the more you have that can be threatened, right? It's a bit like if you've ever played a strategy game, you've got these possessions and each of those you need to protect, right? And the more you claim, the more you have to protect them. But you can be threatened by more. And it's easier for you to be insecure about this, that, and the other. So identity, judgment, and reaction. These three things are signposts to what your ideology might be. And because ideology and identity are fundamentally linked, right? You identify with certain things and as opposed to certain things. So if you're a libertarian, you identify it as, well, it depends on which style of libertarian you are. You identify as a certain, as standing for liberty above all other things, and you're with people who other people stand for liberty, and that there are these people who are authoritarians. And it might even go so far as if they believe in a state, or they're an authoritarian. If they want to have socialism, they're all an authoritarian. And anything that actually makes sense or corresponds to reality that doesn't fit with your identity, you'll just be like, well, firstly, you will have a reaction and feel attacked. And secondly, you may well interpret it as just bollocks, basically, right? Whereas actually you might be able to learn something from it. But then even with centrists, right? Even if people who grew up believing in the status quo, very relatively moderate position for your society, like if anything goes outside of that, the Overton window, you may well just be ideological about what's in the Overton window. So that's the thing. Centrism isn't the way out of ideology either. That's its own ideology. It's just the more normal ideology in your society, right? Any set of beliefs about the world that's like a doctrine that you feel you have to stick to. It doesn't even have to just be a social thing where you've got a group that have this agree on a set doctrine. You can individually come up with your own philosophy and then have that as a strict doctrine, and you're making your own ideology, and you're just not any better. In fact, that's what I did at one point. I was like, okay, I'll think for myself. I'll come up with my own ideas, and I did that, but I was still doing the same thing, just individually. So it really comes down to questioning things, and when you feel threatened, being more honest with yourself, I suppose, and being less attached. Yeah, I give a lot of information there, didn't I?
It's super, super interesting. And so could you say that like each single one of us is ideological, like maybe consciously, but then also unconsciously, just as you mentioned before, with communism, like maybe people growing up in communism, they would never question it because they were not aware of that there's a different perspective or a different filter available. So
maybe not Eckhart Tolle, but a lot of us. And if we feel that we're not, perhaps we should at least question that maybe we are. Look, anyway, because otherwise we might be it's better to question. It's better to be skeptical and consider that you may well be ideological than it is to assuming that you're not ideological is the best way to be ideological, right?
Mm. Yeah, and could you give a couple of more maybe ideologies we are on the one hand probably aware of? You mentioned
Okay, and I'll just give a
capitalism. You
rundown.
mentioned liberatism, communism.
Right.
What are typical ideologies people
So
buy into?
socialism, fascism, liberalism, libertarianism, or even things like monarchism were ideologies, right?
Mhm.
You get there's even the mercantilism was one at one point. Anarchism. I mean, the list goes on, but conservatism, traditionalism is similar, but not quite the same thing.
You also mentioned
Marxism, obviously, which is not necessarily the same as other forms. So, what are you asking?
you mentioned before also feminism, or
Yeah,
maybe also
that's
other
fine.
ideologies, maybe less political, but more in terms of a certain belief system.
An ideology can even be in opposition to something. So, if you're against feminism, but you don't really have a strict idea of what you believe, that is an ideology. You just might not realize it. So, anti any ideology is an ideology.
Yeah, okay, that's interesting. So, what's the conclusion to
Actually,
to?
it doesn't mean if I'm opposed to ideologies, is that an ideology? Sorry, I don't know about that.
Oh, it's interesting to think about. No, if you define ideology as a certain fixed filter which you defend, and then maybe to being against it is to like maybe just to say, hey, like I admit I'm to some extent blind, but I'm acknowledging it and I'm open to find further blind spots, but I'm not about telling you this is a stupid ideology.
Yeah, I suppose that's the difference, isn't it? If you haven't got a strict doctrine you believe in, but rather in a more open, broad, skeptical, open-minded perspective. But that said, when it comes to skeptical, there's the whole skeptic community thing, the atheist community, right? That was itself ideological. The whole,
What
like Richard Dawkins is so opposed to, and people like that are so opposed to religion in an ideological way, right?
so atheism is an ideology, or
Well, new atheism.
and I just lost it. What I wanted to ask him, would you consider cultural? Yeah, you just mentioned cultural religion as an ideology. Would you say government
Oh,
isn't? The belief in government is an ideology. Would you
okay.
say maybe science is an ideology to some extent,
It
or
depends how you look at it, right? Because you can grow up, for example, Christian, and it depends what what your belief is like. If it's open to other ideas, but it just draws upon the Christianity heavily, then that isn't ideological. But more Jehovah's Witnesses are a more typical example. They're not all ideological, so to speak, but if you've got a very essentially is if it's a strict doctrine that you refuse to budge on and you don't question ever, and anything that goes against that doctrine you just refuse to accept, then you're ideological about your beliefs. So really, it's not about there being external ideologies per se, it's about being ideologically minded, which is sticking to a strict doctrine. That's the way I'd put it. Now, I mean, obviously ideologies exist as in the collective conscious as ideas, as things, a set of ideas that people are ideologically in common with, right? So if a bunch of people ideologically agree with certain things, and I suppose that makes an ideology as a thing in itself. but really it comes from our beliefs and our own filters. Just that when we react socially in a society, that I guess creates something more than merely what we believe individually. And well, of course it's going to be social, right? Because we are social creatures.
And would you say it's about finding the commonalities in each ideology, or is it about freeing ourselves from any ideology to wake up to whatever the truth is beyond
Well,
ideology? Or is it because you also mentioned something before along the lines of that, like ideologies fight against each other, who is
yeah.
right, who is wrong, but like depending on their understanding. But is there an absolute right or wrong, or is this always relative to one's perspective, belief, or I mean also,
So you're asking us, is there a reality beyond that?
or like what would you
Yes,
suggest? Is it
but they may
about
well be, but it's harder to access that when you've got these filters in the way blocking your view. And you can't draw upon other ideas in a holistic way if you're too attached to your own. In fact, with neuroscience, there's been this realization where I think it's the prefrontal cortex. I'm not sure if it's that, but essentially when you're stuck in fight or flight or in a sort of helpless state, or then essentially you cycle around between those emotions, between feeling helpless, running away, and fighting in anger, right?
I
And
think
if you're
it's the
stuck in that,
brainstem,
it
right?
gets in the way of understanding and it gets in the way of empathy.
Mm-hmm.
Because you're fighting someone, if you're sort of running away from them, you're not going to, it's harder to view them as someone to empathize with them, really, as someone with their own perspective and experience that you can care about and understand. And so you, but when you can get past that, if you can be mindful enough to be able to not be stuck with attached to that, not reactive, if you can get past that, it activates the part of our brain that is more linked to empathy and understanding and other emotions more so. So
This is
essentially, yeah, go ahead.
super interesting, and what I just understand, and let me just rephrase it to because I think this is so important. If your beliefs are threatened, it's the same as uh, fighting with a lion. It's
Yes.
your brainstem is like in survival mode. It's about fight, flight, freeze,
Yeah. The more
and
firm, sorry,
mm-hmm,
in that vein, that the more firmly we believe in something, the more we identify with it, the more we're setting ourselves up to be in fight or flight, and the more we're impeding our own understanding and our empathy of others because we're too stuck. Or we can have empathy, but we end up having empathy for people in our tribe, but not for people in other tribes. And it's because precisely of that. We get the fight or flight with people outside of the group,
mm-hmm.
which means are stuck in tribes. But then if you've got different people with different groups, only empathizing people within their group, when the groups fight, it's divided society, right? And yeah, when we start to be more, I mean, a bit like how the Buddhists talk about not having too much attachment, right? When we actually follow that approach, there's so much more we can to life, that we can have empathy and understanding of reality in a holistic way that isn't limited to a tribal mindset. Because an ideology, and when you're socializing people in ideology, that's like a tribe, basically. Like psychologically, that's pretty much like having a tribe. But there's so much more. You can look at things in a more universal way, and that's where we get to things like not just a universal or holistic understanding, but the idea of universal love and us being and care about, for example, humanity as a whole. And it's harder to do that, even if you believe in that as an ideal. In practice, if you're stuck in fight or flight, you'll just be stuck in the negative emotions,
Mm.
at least when it comes to people outside of your group.
Yeah, it's super interesting what you said. I mean, in the brainstem, there is no expansive or holistic thinking possible. It's just like you focus on reality is very narrow. It's just about surviving. And you mentioned before that an understanding of the identity and also your own judgment and your reacting is necessary to kind of detach a bit from your belief, and that's also then mentioned prefrontal neocortex, like kind of like to see how then also you start using different areas of your brain when you detach from your beliefs, and you it's not survival mode anymore, and that like in itself enables this expansive understanding, where you look beyond your own little island of like beliefs. And
Yeah,
what
but we choose the island, right? That's the key. If you've ever
and
seen Limitless,
mhm,
he takes this pill and he's less limited. He is using more of his brain. You literally use more of your brain simply by choosing to be less limited, right?
mhm.
So we literally choose the limits of our own brain, of our mind, and from that reality. We don't need a pill. We can be like in Limitless, I suppose, but we just choose it. Or rather, we choose not to put up these filters anymore. Sorry, I
Mm,
interrupted, but I wanted to add
no,
that.
it's very powerful what you say, because like basically what you're saying is that whatever we believe, it defines our perspective on reality. And if we change our beliefs, it changes our perspective, our reality, our experience.
Yeah.
And then from that perspective, it's also interesting to see or look at our society, where there's a lot of division. There's a lot of like camps, tribes fighting each other,
Judgment.
judgment. Yeah. And what, like, how, like, if you look at the big picture, in terms of society, like, would you consider it as functional, or what would you consider the state
There's a
of the world?
widespread dysfunction socially.
And is that something which has been always the case? Is this something like over the centuries which has been changing, fluctuating, or is like if you would look at the big picture, is this something which is like natural to being human, or is it something which we could overcome?
Well, perhaps on a more local level, we used to be in a more harmonious relationship with our communities. And the globalization has done some interesting things. Because on one hand, it's increased the connections over long distances between us, right? But in practice, especially when we commute, with the way we commute so much, and the way because we're able to communicate over long distances, we might become more distant from people nearby. So it may well lead to a more anatomization between us and others, even though, because it's not really tied together so neat and tidily anymore. Okay, let's focus more on what we're talking about. So, well, in a sense, we're more connected, but in another sense, we're less connected because the connections are more disparate. Well, the thing is, at least a physical community in a physical or local area used to generally believe in the same religion, right? So at least they were a tribe in a similar area where they could have that in common. But now the tribe is, but now we're all connected globally. We're connected to people of so many different values and filters that it's so much easier to find people we disagree with of different values, different ideologies, than it is the people with that in common. Whereas before, it was you had to go out of your way to travel somewhere else with a lot of effort to find people with different ideologies and filters, right? So literally what it is to be your tribe is simply a matter of just going to a different website and starting to hang around them online more. Whereas it used to be like you had to walk for a while or take a carriage. And it took days potentially to get to a tribe even slightly different from yours. And to get it to a very different one, it might take months or even years to get to society very different from yours with a completely different ideological filter about reality. So what's happened to our society is we've gotten a situation where I guess that it makes us less united and more in a disharmony. And there's also, I mean, in some ways we've got more caring, but does it really feel like we're caring at the moment? And then there's the whole thing of, I talk about in my podcast, the death of God situation, which essentially is, now that we've become a lot more secular, what's it all for anyway? Like, so we end up repressing a lot of things, becoming more neurotic, because we don't have that foundation of faith to fall back on, that purpose, and all the right brain creative aspect, or maybe more mystical aspect of a psyche is repressed, then we're going to neurotically project around more. And when you do that, you end up stuck more in a fight or flight mentality where other people are causing things that you don't feel that you're responsible. You feel that other people are affecting you and making you react. And when you're stuck in a fight or flight mentality with lots of people, very easy to find people you disagree with neurotic issues, because society has become kind of neurotic, to be honest. That's a recipe.
Could you quickly explain
chaos.
What's neurotic?
I suppose I might not. Okay, so I am drawing upon Jung here in his analysis of, okay, no, neurotic has its own definition, I suppose. I haven't actually got off the top of my head.
Don't mind. I was just curious how you would describe it in your words, or how
the way Jung explained it is when you. Yeah, I suppose if people don't know what it is.
I mean, it's fine. We can add it to the show description.
Symptoms of stress, depression, anxiety, obsessive behavior, hypochondria, and a radical loss of touch with reality, but not a radical loss of touch with reality, but stress, anxiety, and obsessive behavior. Mm-hmm. So, and the way Jung described it is essentially this sort of widespread social, neurosis is a particular kind where he referred to what Nietzsche referred to as the pale criminal, which is this idea of someone who sees flaws in everyone else, but not themselves. You could even link it to narcissism to some extent, this idea of potentially holier than thou, judging everyone else, but not viewing yourself as without flaw. And if we're honest, we do see a lot of that in our society at the moment, a lot of mental health issues as well. And if you combine that with just simply how easy it is on the internet and globalization to find people we disagree with relative to people we agree with, it creates a recipe for widespread social dysfunction. And that's exactly what we've got, especially in I suppose, a godless society, because haven't we evolved to be spiritual? Like, I don't necessarily have proof at hand, but if we're out of touch with nature so much, And the other things I described, it seems like a situation where there's going to be widespread social dysfunction, but we can fix it. But part of it starts with ourselves not being so attached and not setting ourselves up to be stuck in fight or flight, because that gets in the way of us understanding reality and empathizing with other people.
Yeah, that's so a really good description. And I mean, a question would be then, like, is this purposely created to control the people because division and people fighting against
Maybe.
each other but that possibly leads to being like being stuck in survival instead of really
I suppose
looking at the bigger picture.
if the elites know how it works and they haven't revealed the information to us, they
And
may well have used that. But I don't think we can entirely put the blame externally. You're right. I would say that they do play divide and conquer. But I suppose the good thing about chaos is the opportunity to change things. Because if individually going to chaos means you can change how you do things, then collectively that applies as well. If we don't do it, then those with power will decide for us.
so it's really for each single one of us to like acknowledge we might have ideologies, or we have, in a sense, like
Yeah.
blind spots, a certain filter towards reality, and that we have to acknowledge it and then integrate it, find those blind spots, be open, like recognize that we don't know all, and like really be compassionate about other worldviews.
Yeah, and it takes humility and detachment. And honestly, meditating might be the first step. Or maybe even just a little bit of gratitude in the morning. Like 30 seconds of gratitude every morning might be a first step. And if we just take a little bit out of our day to meditate, to breathe, and to be in the moment, rather than having constant racing thoughts about this, that, and the other, it might help us get out of that constantly buzzing, worrying thoughts and all of the stresses of the day. Because these things are more like, can always attract us into a more fight or flight state or stress state. Because if you're more stressed, it's easier for you to be snappy, right? So just a little bit of meditation, and at first it might not seem like it's making much of a difference because it takes time to really see the change. But at a certain point, you won't even realize how much you've changed because it happens gradually. And what it allows you to do is a more detached, mindful perspective. It really does allow you to understand reality better and to empathize with people of different worldviews better. And you will expand your own worldview to be broader, I suppose. That's what I've experienced anyway.
And then that would also lead to finding more meaning, because I mean, I think you mentioned it in your first podcast episode, that nihilism, lack of meaning, is very widespread.
Yeah, and if you've got a filter that doesn't really bring you meaning, then your life won't have meaning. And it's when you're stuck like that, you find yourself just trying to look for distractions. I remember with me, I didn't know what to do in life. All the jobs I was applying for, I didn't actually want to do. So I was only half-hearted about it anyway. I hadn't found the right avenue to express my interests in politics and philosophy and stuff. So I just argued online. That was part of how I distracted myself in these computer games. And I don't think I'm alone in this. A lot of people distract themselves this way. And even people who do have a job, they might not like it in the weekend, just play lots of computer games or what have you. And all these distractions, there's no real purpose to it other than maybe a dopamine fix, right? And that only gives you temporary respite from the fundamental pain of not being in touch with yourself. And that's something Eckhart Tolle talks about, where when you're not present, you're actually in pain, because it's inner peace comes from being present. And when you're silent, when your mind's silent, there's this inner voice that speaks. But that voice is silent when your mind isn't silent, right? So there's this wise part of our psyche that we're not even in touch with. And if we're not in touch with our full psyche, not using the full amount of our brain, only stuck in this brain stem, there's consequences for not being in touch with it and not working with it in a healthy way. It's not just that you could use a lot more of it and get a lot more benefits. There's real cost to your life, because stuff might come up psychologically, subconsciously, that you're not even aware of what that's affecting you. And the whole idea of shadow possession or subconscious possession is that Jordan Peterson talks about ideological possession, but the way I see it, it's really what Carl Jung referred to as, when he talked about how the subconscious can possess you, your shadow can possess you. What it essentially means is this subconscious content that's bubbling up to the surface and manifesting in uncontrolled ways because you're not dealing with it. It's stuff that you reject about yourself, or that you're not dealing with, the emotions you repress. Mm-hmm. Imagine, like, every time an emotion comes up, you feel angry, for example, right, about something, right? Suppose instead of dealing with it and processing it, you just, like a ping pong, ping pong machine, is that, yeah, like in a, you just knock it down again. You just like, no, not going to deal with it because it's just unpleasant. No, go away. And it just speeds up, knocking around inside you, and then it comes up again with more momentum this time. No, don't want to deal with it, don't want to deal with it, go away. And then it comes up, and suddenly you're lashing out, at someone, and they're like, what? I just asked you what the time is or something. And that's one example of it. And that's basically how, when you don't deal with what's going on subconsciously, and when it comes up, that's what it's like to not be grappling with it. Whereas when you do, you let yourself feel it, let it wash over you, and ask yourself what it can tell you, what you can learn from it. It's difficult because you need to actually properly feel that emotion washing over you, and it's unpleasant sometimes. But when you do that, you can let it go, and it's not knocking around inside of you anymore. But what happens if, as a society, it becomes normal to repress things? Then we end up in a dysfunctional society.
Yeah, that's a very, very good description. Love it. Yeah. So it's really about self-awareness and acknowledging whatever happens within your own mind, not suppress it, but look at it, learn from it, to then release it or transcend it in a sense.
Yeah, and if we do that, we can actually be a lot more at peace, a lot happier. And because we can understand what's actually going on better, because what happened, we get cognitive dissonance when we don't understand something, right? And that tends to lead to either fear or anger or other negative emotions. And if you consider the other things we've talked about, like how easy it is to find people we disagree with these days, it's quite a negative picture we're painting, but at the same time, if all we need to do is detach from that and not attach so much, if all we need to do is be a bit more mindful, do a bit of half an hour meditation a day, for example, even 5 minutes, even 30 seconds, the more we, if we choose to, or it could be simply a choice to not filter so much and to ask questions. And if we do this, then we start ourselves on a path towards awakening. And that can simply being more aware of ourselves and what's going on around us. It doesn't need to be some woo-woo mystical stuff about being one with the universe. I mean, it can be if you want. It's your choice. But really, it's just a matter of being more in touch with ourselves and more in touch with reality, even if it's slightly. And it's our choice.
Super powerful. One of the things you mentioned before, I think you called it the law of one. If you want to quickly describe what it is, because I think in your podcast you're also kind of like talking about this.
Okay, essentially it's the idea that all of reality is conscious energy, that one organism, essentially, everything in quantum physics, there's the idea that everything's non-locally connected in the spooky action at a distance, that things interact that aren't nearby as if they're nearby. Now there's talk about different dimensions and and that sort of thing. Well, like maybe we can connect that up with the idea that, okay, if we're aware of that, it might help us relate to the idea that everything is, what it comes down to is everything is one and one whole that we are all parts of. That God is defined as the creator, but the idea is that the creator is broken down into each and every soul, and the soul in the spark of creation is the soul essentially, right? And that every one of us, what we are, is actually the soul inhabiting a body, but that even objects are essentially, they have that spark within them as well. That is simply learning to experience simply being. It's a bit like what's that Japanese religion before Buddhism? Shinto. And there's Chinese philosophies that talk about, and Indian philosophies that talk about a similar idea, that everything is alive and conscious in its own way, and it's all part of one whole, and that we're simply the universe learning about itself. Does that help?
Yeah, it's super interesting, and I guess also for those listening to the show to get a different like frame of reference.
There is an interesting
And
backstory to it, though. The law of one is that the backstory is that there is these scientists. Well, these scientists, of what they were doing, Don Elkins and was working with someone called Carla Rueckert and some other person, I can't remember his name. And what they were doing is scientifically, applying a scientific method to paranormal subject matter. And what they tried doing is, there is something where people channel spirits. And what they do is you can record it with writing or even, so someone gets essentially, the spirit goes inside of them and they speak, but they speak differently. Now, I understand if you're skeptical, but what they did, this is in the 80s, and what they did is they actually recorded what the channel, which was Carla Rueckert in this case, said. And what they're not, she was in a trance, and she was saying these things, and this being was speaking, claiming to be Ra, and it was claiming that it was a being from Venus that used to be a physical being, but transcended into being an energy being, essentially. And it basically told the story about Earth and about the universe, about how it works, and essentially taught the law of one. Now, there's other sources of information similar to it, such as other channelings, or when people are talked about, are put into a trance and they talk about why they're here, right? On Earth, they talk about they're here to experience this, what it's like to be on Earth and to experience a limited existence, but also this time of awakening. And this other source that has a lot in common with it is actually the Emerald Tablets. What's described by, well, claimed by
Can you say the name again?
the name of the person.
No, the tablets. The name of the tablets.
Emerald Tablets. They say very similar things about reality. The Emerald Tablets of Thoth the Atlantean. There's also another one by Hermes Trismegistus or something.
Mm-hmm.
And it's essentially talking about everything being one and the nature of creation and how we manifest our own reality. The law of attraction is a key part of this. And I feel like you talk about this to some extent, Simon. This idea that our beliefs actually manifest reality around us. So if you consider how our perceptions are affected by our filter, then our filter affects the actual occurrences around us through frequency and vibration. Now, if you consider string theory, an M theory, which is an improvement on the theory, it talks about how everything being these tiny strings, and the vibration of strings and different chords affects our reality and determines quantum, what happens on a quantum level and beyond, right? And if you consider that everything can be on a superposition and the superposition collapses into one outcome, if conscious and that we could observe, when we observe the experiment, the observation affects the experiment on a quantum level. This might indicate that this might be actual evidence for the law of attraction, that our beliefs and our consciousness affects actually what happens. And sometimes you get people who walk in the room, they brighten up the room. And that maybe you might feel more positive when you're around them. And that maybe, maybe it's just like, yeah, our beliefs can really determine what happens to us. And that might be really important at a time like this. Whereas if we could just change a few things, we will literally experience just more joy in our lives and more things going more in our favor.
Yeah, it's super interesting. I mean, in the end, if this is not the most important realization in life itself or in this human experience, to wake up to how our filter, our perception, our beliefs create our experience here, and that they're mostly subjective to the starting set or to the personality or ideology, as we talked about today about it. We adopt or have, and that's also not like reality in itself, that we can wake up, or that there's far more, that there's meaning, purpose, fulfillment, cooperation, connectedness.
Yeah, there's also not just this
available.
life, right?
Mm.
So I mean, that's one of the law things the Law of One talks about is reincarnation, and that's something quite common in Asian religions. It used to be part of Christianity
Mhm, mhm.
till the Council of Nicaea and other councils that when they decided to take it out because there was control being applied to it from authority rather than people believing what they want.
I know, like, okay, playing devil's advocate, what would be the benefit of removing that, or like, or not teaching or telling people about the concept of reincarnation? How would that change your perspective?
I mean, you might argue, for example, people might not take this life so seriously if they, if they believe there's many lives, right? But if you consider that your life might be next time might be affected by this life, and if you consider that we're part of a larger whole, that might actually be beneficial for society. Well, fundamentally, I would say that if you want, if you feel invested in certain control, then that would be threatened by belief in that. But it's not as if things have been perfect in societies that believe in reincarnation, though. But it is definitely interesting. It's part of the picture, I would say, regarding with the Law of One, that we are infinite, eternal beings, eternal souls living temporary experiences here. And that part of the limitation of being on Earth relative to being a non-incarnated spirit is through this experience of growing up with these limitations, we can learn a lot of interesting things that we wouldn't otherwise be able to learn, including learning how to unlearn our filter.
Mm.
Because the challenge of that it involves to potentially awaken and understand reality more from the starting point that's more limited, there might be something really worthwhile about that we don't fully understand while we're here. But otherwise, why would we be here? So what explanations do you have anyway?
Yeah, it's a really good question. What's the whole purpose, meaning of this existence or experience here? And yeah, and like, I would completely agree. It's about remembering who we truly are, like awaken or remember what we are, that we are not just this kind of limited perception life. And then it's about, but also exploring, learning, expanding, helping, being connected, because I totally agree. We are all part of this mm, of this reality. Like we all co-created. Like at the end, like we are one. We have different expressions. Each one of us has a very different and unique perspective within this reality. So we can all learn from each other. That's the beautiful thing. That's I mean, that's also the purpose here with this podcast, and also like interviewing you to
Yeah.
really share perspectives, to enable the listener to remove, to unlearn the filter, as you expressed it just right now, which is a beautiful description.
Yeah. You believe, sorry, you said that you asked about an objective reality. And I suppose the objective reality is that we determine our reality. That doesn't mean, I mean, that sounds like it's objectively reality is subjective or something. But I think there are more foundational laws of reality that have to do with, for example, that there's always balance, and that, well, one law might be the law of one itself, that everything is one. Another, that law of that everything's in balance, that the law of attraction, that we attract what our own frequency. So that's how we determine our own reality, through the frequency we're at. And so if there are these fundamental laws of how we manifest and create, and what we can't manifest and create, like there might be limitations just simply for reality to even function. Because if all souls are creating their own reality, there have to be something in common. Otherwise, it might fall apart, right? So there definitely are objective aspects of reality, and we work within those boundaries. But within those boundaries are broad, right? And we can determine our reality to a great extent within that, through the law of attraction and manifestation and frequency.
Mm. Yeah, for example, Mark Pasio also talks about these, he calls it natural law, these underlying mechanisms of our reality, and he refers to 8 laws. No matter if you believe in them or not, they still are relevant. They create your experience, and you're kind of like within this framework. You have free choice about what you do in every single situation, about your actions, your behavior, free will in a sense, but then being subject to these laws.
What are the laws?
The laws he mentions, the first one is, like he calls it, the principle of mentalism. So everything is a construction of the mind.
Right.
The next one is principle of correspondence, which means that kind of like the micro exists within the macro, or as above as below.
Oh,
so
yeah, that's a key thing in the Emerald Tablets, isn't it?
Okay, I don't know about this one,
Right.
but it's really that everything is holographic in a sense. That that you can like. I mean, what can be an example? Like kind of the neural net in your brain, like it's very similar to the constellation of galaxies. Like that. That's one expression of it. Next principle is principle of vibration. Everything vibrates. There's no stillness. Like everything has a sense of vibration. Everything is vibration, energy vibrating with a certain frequency. There's a principle of polarity, like feminine, masculine. Also, how did he describe it? I think also in terms of, but it's an expression of the same. Like for example, if you look at light, like light and darkness. Darkness is just the absence of light, so it's an expression of the same underlying
right.
thing in a sense.
So I've seen some of Mark Pasio's work, and he seems to have this idea of right and wrong, or morality, that's almost doesn't, or at least didn't seem to account for duality or polarity. To me, it seemed like he was saying, well, if you're helping others, that's objectively truth and objectively right, and if you're harming others, that's objectively wrong. Now, I obviously like the idea of helping others, but it just, if there's polarization inherent to reality, then can he say one part of the polarity is true, the other part is false? Wouldn't they be more different reflections of the overall one? What do you think about
that? It's a really good question. From what I remember, how he defined right and wrong is right is what doesn't harm anyone. Like you can do whatever you want as long as you don't harm anyone. And harming is a violation of like rights in a sense, and those are your right for your body to decide what you do with your body. Like so if someone tells you, like for example, for like looking at this definition, consumption of heroin would be totally right, because it's your decision to do what you want with your body. If you were then to harm someone, that would be a wrong, because you don't have the right to harm someone, but to do with your body, you can do what you want. It's your property in a sense. Like he defines a couple of rights. It's the right over your body, over your property, over your will, and also your right to true information. So if someone is violating those rights, that means, for example, physically violating you, or raping you, or maybe trespassing your personal private space, or coercing will, or even lying to you, that is wrong. And
what does the negative side of the polarity, I suppose, when it comes to ethics, why does that exist at all if he thinks it's wrong and inaccurate?
I mean, like, I did not create this. Maybe I did co-create this reality, but it's really interesting to think about that. Possibly this reality is so distorted to have a certain experience, so that there is this negativity, positivity, there is feminine, there is masculine, there's like just different experiences, and maybe it's about just having those experiences, but then also possibly also changing this reality if we were.
We're responsible, right? So we can decide
Yeah,
how it will be, and we can make it more preferable for us.
yes, and also there's this principle of cause and effect, or karma, or consequences, like whatever you do, kind of the effect you will experience. So that in a way, it seems that this is about collecting experiences, and depending on what action you choose, you will have certain consequences. And if you choose whatever, like wrong actions, you will have certain consequences. If you choose right actions, you will have certain consequences. And it's in the end our free will, whatever, to do whatever we want, in a sense, within the framework we have been given. And the tricky thing is that, I mean, I think also here with you talking about those things, it's something I've never learned, never heard in school, and it's like it's a foundational, like, if like this is the most important thing to be talked about in life. And also what we don't hear with this podcast, we don't want to tell anyone like you should be believing this. It's more like inspiring to think for yourself and ask questions, because that's part of becoming more aware, and also being more empowered and having a more fulfilled life. And that's really, really good questions. What resonates with me personally, and that is inspired by Mark Pasio, that there is an objective truth, and those mechanisms, like how reality operates, this 3D reality, that they are there, they're objective, they are there, and it doesn't matter what you believe, and you're subject to that mechanism. And he defines freedom as, or first of all, awakening as being less and less subjective in your perception of reality, and waking up to objectivity, like recognizing that there are laws. And he defines freedom as being more aligned with these laws, and not and acting according to these laws. And that's really interesting. Maybe that's something we can talk about in another podcast session.
Yeah, it is interesting, because like, if some people might look at what Mark Passy is saying and say, okay, that he's actually being really relativist, because he's saying how we determine our reality and we manifest based on our vibration. And but at the same time, he's saying, Mark Passy is saying, yeah, there's this objective reality. This is how it is. So he's not saying, and there's some people who might talk about objective reality, and they might be very insistent, like objectivists, like people followers of Ayn Rand, for example. I'm very strict about what they think about objective reality is. And they might be talking about things that we actually manifest in a more relative way and call that objective. So I suppose what maybe what we're talking about here is there are certain foundational objective laws, which and when we aligned with that, that's objective. But at the same time, there's a lot of leeway within that based on those laws, such as the law of vibration and the law of I can't remember the names you gave for them, but how we manifest our own reality with the law of attraction. And because of that, it's like objective laws that include some subjective, a wide range of subjective manifestation within it. And that's really interesting because it sounds contradictory, but actually it's not. It's holistic, I think.
Yeah, the question is, will we ever be completely objective? Probably not. And
maybe if you go one with the creator.
Yeah, he defines awakening also as in a very interesting way, or basically enlightened, being enlightened. If you assume everything is a frequency, or everything vibrates with a certain frequency, like your personal, like individual consciousness, awareness of reality equals a certain vibration. Like, let's assume this, and I don't know the English expression, but let's assume like there's a certain frequency with a certain oscillation, yeah, and like over a certain period, whatever, like 5 times over this period. That's my individual awareness, like my frequency of thought, consciousness. And if we assume objective truth, like reality is objective truth, yeah, like he gives the picture of a flat line. That's being completely objective. This is truth. And like with my subjective awareness, with kind of like having this 5 waves over this certain period, I have 5 times interaction with reality. So over a certain time frame or a certain interval, I have a limited amount of interactions with truth. And the more I awaken, the more enlightened I become, the more objective I become in my perception of reality, the higher my frequency of consciousness, of thought, the more interactions with truth I have.
In time, over a set.
For example, in time, yeah.
Right. So if you just literally, it's faster, it goes up and down faster, then there's a lot. Literally more intersections you can actually measure over a certain distance or time relative to the straight line. That's actually, that's actually a powerful metaphor, or perhaps more than a metaphor. I'm sure obviously that's reducing it down to a core principles that's easy to understand, but and obviously as we get to higher levels of being and frequency, then it will increase and increase and increase in frequency until
it might potentially just flatline.
Yeah.
There's no difference to the flat line anymore.
Or at least it becomes meaningless anyway, because it's, it balances out. And that is source, right? But what if that source line itself has a frequency? It's just that relative to us, it's straight. I don't know.
I don't know. I can just theorize about it. It's really interesting to also think about that. Potentially energy, it's just a creation of consciousness in itself, and like energy vibrates, and like and maybe there's something beyond vibration too. Maybe there's, but those are like really good questions. I don't have.
According to the law of one, well, there's 7 densities, right, of frequency, right? And this is just kind of an arbitrary measurement, and this is like how much frequency you have, and also how much light you can hold within you, like your spark of creation, or whether it's a flame or what have you. And the seventh level, so the first is this being, the second is like animals, the third is like us choosing whether we serving others or serving ourselves, basically. The fourth is like love, depending on like, whether we love in a selfish way or love in a selfless way. And most people would say selfless, right? Then there's the fifth, which is about wisdom. The sixth, which is about unison. It's about unity, I suppose, between those two priorities. Then there's the seventh, which is like the God level, essentially. But what happens when you go to the next level is, of course, it's a new octave. Well, the next level is just the first density of a new octave up. And if you go down, then it's the same. And that's infinite and fractal. And that's what's beyond, according to the law of one. That all of infinity, all of the infinite holographic reality, it's not just these levels of frequency, but the highest level of frequency is also the lowest level of frequency of the next level, right? And that the creator is the soul that's manifesting the holographic reality in that way. And that soul, each soul is linked to every other soul and makes up a larger whole that is the infinite creator or source, right? So it's almost like there's a holographic reality, and manifesting all of it, like the cracks between the wall, is source everywhere. So it doesn't matter if it's infinite. There's no top to the pyramid of the top to the creation, or where it all comes from. It's like it goes on for infinite, but every soul makes up part of the larger and infinite creator, right? And that's fascinating. I don't know how much time you have, but yeah.
I guess we have still something left to be explored over the next weeks, months, years. In this reality, there's like incredible complex and like I want to be respectful with your time too. So maybe we can have another conversation on another podcast episode or so. But like at this point, I want to really thank you very much for taking your time. Is there something you want to share with the world, or something you want to tell to the listeners?
Well, I just talked about infinity, didn't I? So I'm not sure what else there is to mention. Well, thanks for the opportunity. I didn't know I would be just intuitively just talking this much, but it's really been enjoyable. Yeah, it's a different experience being interviewed to interviewing someone, definitely. But I hope people have enjoyed it.
Yeah, super cool. Thank you, Nick. Yeah, and it was a true pleasure speaking to you. And till next time.